So memory structures and processes. Everything that we do as humans cognitively depends on memory. Memory's been thought of as both a process and a structure, and it's really important that you understand the difference between a process and a structure. A process is basically just a set of events or a set of steps that are being completed to do something. And we don't care what the underlying machinery is. All we care about is identifying what the steps are. And that's what we mean by process. Structure is where you do care what the machinery is. You're trying to identify what all the different parts are of the thing. So with memory, for example, we talk about all the different types of memory and the structures that are involved in mediating memory. So there's a very important distinction between process and structure. Researchers have viewed memory in terms of processes, structural units, storage units, and different systems. So there's been a whole bunch of theories about memory. Researchers have also attempted to identify several different types of memory. So for example, memory based on duration. So is it real short or real long? Memory based on content. So what kind of memory is it? Memory based on retrieval, memory based on the reference to the self, to you, or memory based on vivid details and emotional context, memory based on intentionality of retrieval, and memory for future tasks. All these different types of memories have been theorized about, researched by memory researchers for the past 60 or 70 years. One of those types of memory is working memory. It's a very sort of robust type of memory concept because it appears in many different theories. But working memory involves information about a task that is currently in your focus of attention. So the thing that you're currently focused on right now. So working memory helps us to complete tasks that we're currently attend to. And it also helps us to keep track of other things in our environment. And it also helps us to ignore things that are not important or irrelevant. In some cases, the limits of memory are based on the limits of our attention in terms of what we can code efficiently and focus on for appropriate cues for retrieval. So, in other words, memory memory depends on how much we can focus on and store and work with at any given time all at once. So it's very much dependent on our capacity for attention. So memory is a structure or process. Some researchers view memory as a thing, an actual object that such as a storage unit or a structure where information is held. So, for example, Aristotle, in one of the earliest theories of memory, talked about that memory is like wax. It can be molded into different shapes to store. It can be melted, which is kind of analogous to forgetting. And it can be remolded so that, how memories are change over time. So Aristotle used this notion of wax as memory. It's important to note that many psychological theories over the centuries have been based upon the latest technology that's available. So in this case, Aristotle was using a piece of technology that was available to him, that is wax. Memory can also be thought of as so memory is, in a very broad general sense, a filing system, a way for information to be organized in different ways. That's essentially, at a very high level, what it is. You can also think of memory, besides being just a thing, you can also think of memory as being a collection of processes, all working together interdependently. So, for example, there's a process that we use called remembering. Whenever we pull a memory out of our long-term memory and bring it into our current consciousness or working memory, that's a process. There are three important processes in memory, three big ones that have been studied forever. Not only are they different processes for achieving different things, but another really cool thing about these three processes is that we can actually localize, to a certain extent, each of these processes to different parts of the brain. For example, there's encoding. Encoding is the process by which information comes into our memory. So whatever type of memory you're talking about, whether it's short-term memory, long-term memory, sensory memory, whatever, there's a process for encoding, for turning that information into a representation in our memory. Storage is the process by which information is kept in memory, however we keep it. And of course, if you store it, you have to be able to pull it out again, and that's retrieval. Retrieval is the process of outputting information from memory. As I said, these three different processes can be distinguished not only by different functions, but also by the fact that they could be that they involve different brain areas. The modal model of memory basically classifies memory according to duration. In other words, how long does the memory last? And in this model of memory, we have three different types of memory models, or memories, I guess, not memory models, but three different types of memories. The first is sensory memories, and these are very brief memories that occur as you're processing the environment. We're talking on the order of milliseconds. So for example, if you stare at a page, for a white page with black letters for a while and then look away real quick, you will see briefly the letters, floating around, and then they'll fade away real quick. That's sensory memory. Short-term memory are brief memories. These are brief memories that we're working on at any given time. They tend to fade away unless we do something with them, unless we rehearse them, for example. If we rehearse them and keep doing that type of rehearsal, for example, short-term memories can be turned into long-term memories. And these are longer memories that are held across a much longer time period. This modal model of memory describes these types of memories along with all of the structures which hold the memories for different lengths of time, and those are covered at length in your book. Let's talk a little bit about sensory memory. Sensory memory is the briefest form. It includes memories of raw, unprocessed sensory information, which is known as, for the visual system, which is known as iconic memory. We're talking just, seconds or milliseconds. It's visual representation. So the visual sensory memory, or the visual iconic memory, representation of a scene that exists in its sensory form, and then it's lost from sensory memory within a second. So since it's so short, it only lasts, half a millisecond, a second, maybe 2 seconds at the most. Since it's so short, sensory memory is really hard to study because, it's just barely on the periphery of awareness and perception. So it's really hard to study. But Sperling became quite famous in the 60s for coming up with a way of studying this sensory or iconic memory. Essentially what he would do is he would put he would have subjects, human subjects, looking into a device called a tachistoscope. Tachist means fast, right? So it flashed images really, really quickly, like just a few milliseconds. And what he would do is he would ask his subjects to only report partially what they saw. So he would say, okay, you're going to be flashed something, and I just want you to tell me, don't describe everything that you saw in this real super duper fast thing. Just tell me partially what you saw. And he would use this partial report method where the subjects were only reporting a portion of the information presented. And by doing this, he was able to see that people could only do this for about a second after they saw the picture. That was about it. They couldn't do it any. But by then, after a second, the memory was cleared, and there was nothing that the subjects could report. So if he waited for more than a second and then asked the subjects, "Tell me what you saw in the lower left hand corner," after a second, they couldn't. They weren't able to do that. But if it flashed and they were told to report immediately what they saw in the, say, upper right-hand corner, they would be able to do it. But after a second, they couldn't. Short-term memory, sometimes abbreviated STM, is an intermediate memory storage. So it's in between. Usually the way it's thought of is it begins the processing of perceptual information that's transferred out of sensory memory. Another word for short-term memory that's used, another term for short-term memory that's used is working memory, which I used earlier. Working memory is also used to describe the system that controls the processing and the activation of information that's held in short-term memory. So this guy, Clive Waring is not able to move memories from short-term memory to long-term memory because he suffered from a severe case of encephalitis, which essentially killed his hippocampus. And the hippocampus is a part of the brain that is involved in processing short-term memories and somehow getting those short-term memories into long-term memory. And he was unable to do that. I mean, he could hold things in short-term memory, but was essentially unable to remember them after a few minutes because he was unable to encode information from short-term memory into long-term memory. Short-term memory has a certain capacity. In other words, it can only hold so much. Right. And one of the things that's a little confusing about understanding the capacity of short-term memory is that there's this concept called chunking. And chunking is where you take information that's, kind of in different little different chunks of information and chunk it together into more meaningful chunks. So, for example, if I wanted to remember, that I needed to pick up, some bread, Diet Coke, milk, and apples from the grocery store, that would be 4 things, right? What I could do is I could tell myself, okay, I need to get 4 items from the grocery store. Okay, 4 items. And I would go through those 4 items, but what I'm going to remember is 4 items. Now I'm not going to try to remember each one of them, rehearse that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep in my mind the number 4. 4 items. That's it. I just need to get 4 items. Once I get to the store, I can go through my list and I can say, oh yeah, it was Diet Coke, apples, milk, and bread, whatever the other one was, right? And then I can go through, but I know I have to have 4 items. So I've chunked those 4 separate grocery items into one concept, the number 4. Okay. So we can hold 7 plus or minus 2 separate items in short-term memory for a while, or we can hold 3 to 5 chunks. Chunks, of course, are a great way to increase the amount of information that you hold. But it varies a lot. The capacity for short-term memory varies a lot. It depends on the type of information that you are storing. So, for example, if it's information that you're really familiar with and you work with every day, it's going to be a little bit easier for you to hold more information than if it's like new stuff that you're trying to figure out. It also is related to our attentional limits, how good our attention is. So if you're well rested and well fed, your attention is going to be very high and you're going to be able to hold more in your short-term memory versus if you haven't slept in 2 days and you're hungry, right? Your attention is going to be completely whacked. So short-term capacity, the capacity of short-term memory does depend on the type of information as well as your limits of attention. But remember this magic number 7 plus or minus 2. It's usually referred to as the magic number, right? Which is the number of objects we can hold in short-term memory. The duration of short-term memory. So information enters short-term memory when we focus our attention on specific information in our sensory memory. It disappears from short-term memory when our attention moves on to the next thing, right? So it's only going to be there as long as our attention, that little attentional spotlight, is sort of shining on it. Memories are held in short-term memory for as long as our attention lasts. This is some of the famous work of Peterson and Peterson from 1959. One of the things that was discovered with regard to short-term memory are the concepts of retroactive interference and proactive interference. Retroactive interference is when new information replaces old information in a memory store. So, for example, let's say you have a new you get a new computer. You go from a Windows 10 computer that you've been using for a while, and then all of a sudden you get a Mac. And you get a Mac, and you're using that Macintosh computer for a couple of years. And then all of a sudden somebody asks you, hey, do you know how I can set up a new printer in my Windows machine? And you might forget. You might not remember quite exactly how to do it. Whereas a couple of years ago, it was something instant. You could instantly do it. You knew your way around a Windows 10 computer. And this is due to retroactive interference. This is due to the new information that is coming into your memory related to your Mac. And it's basically replacing the old information that you had with regard to your Windows machine. Sort of the opposite of retroactive interference is proactive interference. This is when old information that is already stored in short-term memory keeps information from being stored. So I actually have this problem quite a lot where if I'm trying to remember somebody's name, if that name is similar to another name that I've known before, I'm going to have a really hard time remembering that new person's name. So let's say I meet somebody named Simon. I'm going to get proactive interference from that name because it's in my mind it gets conflated with Sebastian, and I know I've known people named Sebastian, and then if I'm trying to remember this person Simon's name, I'm gonna be like, oh God, it's Sebastian, but I can't remember what this new Simon person's name is, right? That's proactive interference, is where the old information is sort of keeping information from being stored. You can also, that can also happen just in short-term memory by itself. If you're holding a phone number in your head and you don't want to forget it, and then somebody gives you another phone number that you're supposed to remember, and if you're really still focused on that first phone number, you're not going to remember that new phone number. That's proactive interference. Long-term memory. So we've gone from sensory memory to short-term memory, now long-term memory. Long-term memory is what appears to be an unlimited store long-term storage of memory after some elaborative processing has occurred. So in other words, after you've processed and focused on and rehearsed in some way the information that's in short-term memory, that information can move out of short-term memory and be encoded into long-term memory. It can store information for long periods of time. Memory stored in long-term memory is stored according to semantic features. In other words, it's stored according to meaning, the meaning that we attach to the words that define the different concepts and attributes of the thing that we're trying to remember. So it'll be stored if you're trying to remember, a picture of a large blue bird. Well, the semantic features that are going to be used to store that thing are the large, the blue, and the bird. Those are different attributes of this object bird that you're trying to remember. Like I said, it's generally agreed that long-term memory is unlimited, so that we haven't been able to detect any sort of limit of terabytes of long-term memory that we have. Now, there's different types of long-term memories. That have been identified. One of the types of long-term memories is episodic memory. And episodic memory is specific to you. It is memory of your daily experiences or your daily life. So, where did you go to 6th grade? What did you wear at your, high school graduation? What is your last name? Where did you live when you were 5 years old? What did you have for breakfast yesterday? These types of things are episodic memories, specific memories that are associated with events that happen to you. So biographical types of memories. Semantic memories are memories of general knowledge that we have, but it's not specific in time or place, or not really specific to you. So this is the type of stuff that you're learning in school. So what is the meaning of cognitive psychology? What is the capital of France? What city is the capital of France? What's further, Australia or Mexico? Who is the president of the United States? On and on and on. All these different facts, general knowledge that we have about the world around us. This general knowledge is not specific to us. It's not specific in time or place so much, but more than that, it's not specific to us. It's outside of the episodic memory. And then finally, there's procedural memory. And really, this is the memory of how to do things, how to do certain motor skills and tasks. So, for example, driving. Driving is a huge example of procedural memory. All of the different things that you have to coordinate and do while you're driving. If you remember, it was very tough when you were first learning, right? Driving was very tough when you were first learning, but over time, you got better and you increased your skills. Even, simple skills like, riding a bike, how to cook a scrambled egg, all of these different things are different types of procedural memory for different skills. Working memory. Let's talk a little bit about the working memory system. Working memory is one system that has been proposed to control for the control of memories that one encodes in, stores in, and retrieves from short-term memory. Okay, so it's all the stuff that you retrieve out of short-term memory. Another definition of working memory describes it as a system that can control the memories that we're currently, quote, working on or operating on in our minds. So if I ask you to, think about Think about what you did. Think about the most fun thing that you did this weekend and tell me why it was so fun. Well, you're going to pull that out of your long-term memory, and you're going to hold it in your long-term memory, and you're going to be analyzing it in your short-term memory, and using that, using your working memory to deal with the question at hand. Basically, working memory is for processing units of information that is the current focus of our attention. One of the more important models of working memory is the model of Baddeley. That's how I say his name. I don't know if that's correct pronunciation or not, but Baddeley's model. Baddeley's model contains multiple storage subsystems. So he's kind of taken working memory and identified different types of working memory. And these different types are based on the different types of information that we have to process. He also proposes the existence of a central executive subsystem that's sort of on top of all of these other working memories. And this central executive controls the flow of the information between the other storage subsystems and long-term memory. And it helps to decide where your attention will be at any given moment. So, for example, one of the subsystems that Baddeley has theorized on is the visuospatial sketchpad. The visuospatial sketchpad, that's hard to say, is responsible for the storage of visual information in working memory. It's kind of like you can think of it as like a dry erase board where you put up you're visualizing you're visualizing how your car looks when it's nice and clean. Well, that gets put up on the dry board. Then the next thing you're thinking about is how cute your cat looks when he's asleep. Then that gets replaced in your working memory. Another type of subsystem that Baddeley speculated on was called the phonological loop. The phonological loop is where verbal information is stored, and it's stored in a loop in the subsystem, and then it's replaced by new information as it comes in. The reason it's called a loop is because while it's stored, it's sort of being repeated so that it sort of stays in the working memory. As soon as new verbal information comes in, new words come in that you hear, it gets replaced. So as you're listening to somebody speak, say for example, as you're listening to me speak, the words that you're hearing are constantly being replaced in the phonological loop by what you're hearing. The phonological loop seems to be the numero uno method of storing information for short periods of time. We seem to rely pretty heavily on listening and using our phonological loops to store information briefly. Next, we have what Baddeley referred to as the episodic buffer. And this is a subsystem of working memory that is used to handle the brief storage of episodic memory. So in other words, the brief storage of episodic memories whenever the phonological loop or the sketchpad are otherwise engaged. So, and the reason it's kind of a goofy concept, and the reason Baddeley had to come up with this was because, if you think about it, think about that you're sitting, let's say you're sitting at work and you're focused really hard on, working on this particular problem that you're dealing with at work. So you're sitting there in front of your computer and you have a spreadsheet open, or you're, or Microsoft Word open, and you're working really hard and you're focused on it. So your entire working memory is being occupied by that task. So your visual spatial sketchpad and your phonological loop are just, working really hard to help you deal with that problem. You're going to be ignoring things that are going on around you. So if you're sitting in one of these open offices, you're going to be, kind of like focused on your task, and you're not going to be paying attention to anything that's going on around you. But if somebody says your name, you're going to hear it and you're going to pay attention to it. And that's why Baddeley came up with this notion of an episodic buffer, because it seems like we do have this ability to focus on things that are related to us, events related to us, episodic events related to us, even when our phonological loop and our visual spatial sketchpad are involved in doing something else. So it's kind of a goofy concept, but kind of like he had to come up with some way of explaining that, and it's not very well studied. The central executive is the manager of the working memory system. So these different, the sketchpad, the phonological loop, the episodic buffer, these things can't just be working independently of each other. Obviously, they have to be coordinated. And they have to be coordinated with long-term memory. They have to decide what gets stored in long-term memory. And that's the job of the central executive. It's the manager of the working memory system. It controls the flow of information between the three storage subsystems, the visual, spatial, phonological, and episodic. And it also controls the flow of information between the episodic buffer and long-term memory, and which part of the system is the current focus of attention. So basically, it's responsible for regulating and controlling all of the flow of information between all of these different systems. Now, we can go beyond Baddeley's model. There's been a lot of research that's been done on this model. Cowan suggests that the working memory is just part of long-term memory. So Cowan, as discussed in your book, is saying there really isn't a working memory. It only looks like that because working memory is just long-term memory that is currently activated in our attention. So really, instead of there being these working memory structures that Baddeley has speculated on, what Cowan is saying is that no. The only thing that working memory is when our attention flashes on to a certain spot in long-term memory, and that activates that spot in long-term memory, and that's what becomes our working memory. In Cowan's theory, long-term memory is the main memory system, with working memory operating on a part of long-term memory that's currently active in our attention. Jonides, Jonides, and colleagues, there in your book, are conducting research of working memory using the techniques of cognitive neuroscience. So they're actually going into the brain and using things like functional magnetic resonance imaging, PET scans, and EEGs to see, what the brain is doing while we're using working memory and while we're transferring information from working memory into long-term memory. To see, for example, is Cowan correct or is Baddeley correct? Or is it some combination of the two, which it usually is? Retrieval from long-term memory. There's two types of retrieval that we know of. One of them is recall, and the other one is recognition. Recall tasks are intentional retrieval tasks that either provide specific cues to aid in retrieval or do not provide specific cues. So it's either free recall or cued recall. Basically, so I give you a cue to kind of remind you briefly, to give you a little cue, give you a little clue as to what I want you to recall, and then you pull it all out of memory. And that's what a cued recall task is. Or a free recall task is if I just ask you to generate some information based on your past experience. That would be like free recall. This would be similar really to or analogous to, I guess, a essay test. So if I give you an exam that is an essay exam, that is going to basically be pure recall. I'm going to give you a question, and then you're going to have to generate the information out of your memory. Recall. The other type of retrieval from long-term memory are recognition tasks. Recognition tasks ask subjects to verify whether information has been experienced before. So whether the information is old or new. For example, this is very similar to like a multiple choice test. In a multiple choice test, you're given the question and then four choices, 5 choices for the answers. And theoretically, as you know, it's harder than it seems, but theoretically, the correct answer is there. It's looking at you in the face, and theoretically, all you have to do is recognize it in order to answer the question. Implicit memory tasks. Implicit memory is a procedural type of memory that alters performance that's based on previous experiences. Okay, so implicit memory tasks are designed to measure memory without intentional retrieval. So, for example, let's say, have you ever had the experience where you're out and about, you're out shopping or whatever, or on campus, and then you see somebody, and you're like, I've seen that person before. Right? It's not like you were sitting there like processing each face that you saw and said, have I seen this person before? No. Have I seen this person before? No. You're just walking around, right? And you see this face and you're like, wow, I've seen that person before. That is a retrieval occurred without you trying to retrieve it. You weren't specifically trying to retrieve that cue, that face. It just happened, and that's what implicit memory is. It's basically a memory function without intentional retrieval. It's just you recognize something, right? Prospective memory refers to remembering to perform a task at some point in the future. So basically remembering to stop at your store on the way home. For example, Einstein and McDaniel showed that one of the things that mediates prospective memory is that it's mediated through cues in our environment. So one of the things that helps us to remember those future tasks are things that are in your environment. So and that implies that if you want to be better at remembering future things, well, one of the ways to do that is to tie it to cues in your environment. So for example, let's say you drive home from work every day, and if you're like me, if you drive the same route every day, you kind of go on autopilot. You're just like cruising down the freeway, and your subconscious is taking you home. But let's say that one day your spouse says, hey, can you go by this store and pick up this prescription for me at this store after work? So you're like, okay, you have to remember to do that. You have to remember to do that, and you have to divert yourself from, instead of going home, stopping off at this store and then going home. Now, I typically have a really hard time with that, because when I get in my car, I just automatically go. But let's say you wanted to remember, let's say it was really important for your spouse. So what do? Well, one thing that I do is, if my spouse tells me, okay, I have to pick this up, what I'll do is I'll pick some point in my path. I'll pick some point in my path that I'll remember and associate with that task. So let's say, along the drive home, there's this billboard with this stupid advertisement for, like a lawyer or something. And I'll tell myself, okay, when I see that billboard, it'll remind me that I need to go to the store to pick that item up for my spouse. So I'm driving along on autopilot, and then I see this billboard, and it's like, oh yeah, that reminded me, right? So you can use cues in your environment to help you remember prospective things that you have to remember for the future.